Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoudé, Noel J. Kent, Professor Emeritus. And with us to discuss the topic is Noel J. Kent, Professor Emeritus, and Professor Emeritus John Okamura, who retired, they retired at the same time, actually. So welcome all, thank you for coming. And Noel, we'll start with you. Tell us, how did you come to Hawaii first, and your first interactions and connections with the university and then the ethnic studies program, and then we go from there.
Well, I've had a very fortunate association here. To put it mildly. I came in 1965. I had been a student at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and I was taking some courses in East Asia, and I was getting very interested in Asian history and politics, and the East-West Center was kind enough to give me a fellowship for 2 years. So I came and I did a master's degree here, and I really enjoyed Hawaii and the people, the life, the lifestyle. It really opened up a whole new world, and all sorts of cultures I'd really been totally oblivious about. So I came back in 1970 after teaching on the mainland for a while, and in 1972, a guy named Pete Thompson, a very well-known community organizer who was with ethnic studies, basically suggested that I might want to teach a course in haoles in Hawaii, of which I didn't know very much, but yes, I will teach the course. And that was the unlikely beginning of a 48-year sojourn with the Ethnic Studies Department. So that was that. At the time, I'd been writing some articles about Hawaii and about American history and American politics, and you know, I guess the people and I've been involved in a number of struggles that the department was involved in to preserve its existence, and I guess they decided that, hey, this guy deserves a chance. Let's bring him aboard, which was lovely. So
yeah, so you did your research on haoles in Hawaii to be able to teach the course. So you expanded your horizons and knowledge, and experience was extended in terms of Hawaii. And
I was getting very interested in tourism. I was getting very interested in the the dynamics of the way in which the economy functioned and the political system functioned. And so I was doing just a series of articles and having some conversations and lectures about it. And as time went on, I got more and more interested, and ultimately I got into the PhD program here in political science, and I did a dissertation on how Hawaii had evolved as an economic and political entity, and yeah, that was so it was lovely. And in 1979, I came on full-time as a full-time faculty member, and stayed and stayed and stayed.
That's good that you stayed. You advanced knowledge in this regard. Your master's is in history, right? From UH too? Okay. And then I remember you getting the PhD in Poli-Sci in 1979. Yeah. The other thing is that I remember that we have met in 1975. And in fact, I remember we met at the Jefferson Hall at the East West Center, and you were coming with your bike, and then we sat down.
Remember this?
Yeah, and chatted.
45 years ago, and you remember this?
Oh yeah. For a long while we chatted, etc., and then it became a relationship, an enduring relationship. So here we are, talking about your emeritus status, So you wrote, before we involve Jonathan Okamura in the discussion, you wrote an important book in terms of the literature, political economy literature about Hawaii, which was Islands Under the Influence. So could you say something about how that developed, and not necessarily why you wrote it, because you mentioned something about that you've been writing. And what did you think the impact has been up till now, actually, of that book?
Well, the title, I have to admit, the title of the book was stolen from a movie at the time called A Woman Under the Influence, which some people may remember here. John may remember that, and you too. Which is, I thought, a terrific movie. And so, Islands Under the Influence, why not? And there had been a series of books. Larry Fuchs wrote one, and and others, basically dealing with the current model, the economic model, and the way in which it privileged certain classes of people and privileged outsiders and this sort of thing. And looking at the semi-colonization of Hawaii, over a long period of time, and the racism that this involved. And there was, at the time, and you remember this for him well, I think there was this dependency theory going around as a popular theory in political science. And I just used it was very simple. I just applied dependency theory of people like Andrew Gunder Frank and folks like that to the dynamics in Hawaii at the time, what was happening. And, I thought it worked fairly well. And the book, got has had some credibility, and apparently, for some reason, people still look at it. I was checking out of Kakua Foods the other day, and the cashier said, "Oh yeah, I just read your piece about the development of sandalwood and whaling and tourism," and I thought, people are still reading this, and it's gratified, of course. It's nice, but. I think it really has a tremendous, in the book, I never imagined that tourism, for instance, would become absolutely and completely dominant in Hawaii. And in the recent pandemic, just absolutely eviscerated, absolutely destroy, the economy and leave so much misery in its wake as this incredibly vulnerable industry that we've adopted as our dominant economic tool. And so basically it set out, I think, a lot of the beginnings of the parameters of what the problem of overdependence on a single industry means, and who basically benefits from it and who doesn't, and what overseas control over the overseas stranglehold by corporations over Hawaii has really left us with, and made us so incredibly vulnerable at times like this. So that's the value of the book.
Yeah. We can see the importance of having more than one industry right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. So there you have it. I remember it's a 1983 book by Monthly Review Press, actually. And in my classes about Hawaii, because they talk about the progression of the political economy, I use 3 chapters of that, of your book, Islands Under the Influence, as we progress in terms of the political economy. So it's an important, it has its place in what Edward Said would talk about as you know, a body of knowledge in terms of the literature on any particular subject. Yeah, so it has its real place. John, thank you for coming again. And so we have been colleagues for a long while, even before you coming to ethnic studies, because you and I, for instance, have met before. So could you say something about your relationship with Noel, and also in terms of the academic relationship, of course, and his particular writings and scholarship?
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. Noel mentioned tourism and the state of our collapsed economy, because that was one of the first things I read by him that appeared in an edited collection called A New Kind of Sugar. I don't know if you recall that, Noel. I think it was late 70s when it came out. You know, they were referring to the tourist industry, of course, but well, I'll just reminisce a little bit. The first time I met Noel was at a demonstration at the East-West Center when the brother of the Korean dictator, Chun Doo-hwan, came. There were a number of us outside on the sidewalk, including Ed Owasa, who was good friends with Ibrahim and myself at that time too. And then Ed showed up with this hood over his head, and everyone thought, oh, it must be one of the Korean graduate students who wants to remain anonymous. And then Ed shows up and says, oh, how's it, guys? But anyway, that was the first time I met Noel at that demonstration across the street. But going back to Hawaii Islands Under the Influence, as Ibrahim said, the first edition came out in '83, the second edition, '93 by UH Press. And I wanted to ask Noel if he was to write a third edition, a preface to the third edition at this time, what would he emphasize about the political economy of Hawaii? You kind of alluded it in terms of your comments about tourism, but more generally also in terms of ethnic relations in Hawaii.
Obviously, you know, obviously one would want to analyze what the lessons of the pandemic have been, and how you know, what role tourism should play in the future. I just did a piece for Civil Beat recently, in which I asked the question of can we make tourism a public good, which I think is the question at this point, which also gets into the clear of how many. We had 10.4 million tourists here in 2019, which overwhelmed the infrastructure and everything else, and has really aggravated people to the point where, I mean, I think a recent Star Advertiser poll survey found that I think 75% of the people interviewed said there were too many tourists here, and the tourism was a real problem. And when in any place when the host population turns against tourism as an industry, that's the end of the industry. The industry can't really function because the word soon gets out that you know, the local people are hostile, and you know, so that could happen here too. So we need some serious conversation starting in this legislative session about how we could, when ultimately the you know, the vaccines and everything else come through, and the pandemic sort of recedes a little bit, how we could take, if we're going to welcome more people, and obviously we are, economically, that's, you know, still vital. How many do we want? How many airlines do we want coming here? What sort of usage of facilities? What about the RAIT? Shouldn't they be taxed? I mean, we have to look at tourism in a completely different way than this very laissez-faire sort of way we've looked at it in the future. It has to be an industry which serves our needs as local people here, and it has not. And I think the collapse of it really indicates it. And I think there is a very different feeling by local people toward both the tourist and especially the industry and the way it functions than there was even 10 or 15 years ago. So it's time to really move forward with a whole different agenda.
Yeah. On that, I remember like Marian Kelly talk about loss of control, and she wasn't the only one, but she was one of the first people to talk about that Hawaii has lost control over its destiny. Meaning, for instance, it's not up to the governor, for instance, to say how many airlines and how many seats each airlines can bring to Hawaii, so to speak. But it's the decision of the airlines, and if the governor says no, then they can like shut off Hawaii, you know, and then it just like goes down the tube, the economy here. So in terms of loss of control, the question is, how could we diversify, especially when this concept or idea of diversification has been with us even before Governor John Burns, you know? So could we speak about, you know, the dependency relationship, which is an important thing, you know, between Hawaii and the metropole, which is, you know, the continent, shall we say, DC and those other places.
You know, one of the things we also see in the pandemic is that we see the advent of people who are very affluent people from the mainland fleeing here, taking refuge in Hawaii because we have fairly modest numbers of cases and also deaths, and sort of using Hawaii as an escape, the way other people use the Caribbean as a sort of escape from you know, Chicago or Los Angeles or whatever. And I wonder if what we're seeing isn't a huge demographic shift where people with a lot of money, you know, especially given the housing market and the pressure, the economic pressures on people just to stay here, where you'll see more and more dyed-in-the-wool local people who have deep, deep roots in Hawaii being forced to move out, large numbers of them. And, you know, getting fairly affluent or very affluent folks from around the globe, moving to a place like this and basically changing the whole character of what we value, you know, as in our ohana in Hawaii here. So that could be one of the consequences of this, that the people are looking for security, for safety, for a place, and, you know, and also a place that's free from the kind of extreme weather changes that are going to take place, for instance, in the Southwest and other places in the next few years that probably won't affect Hawaii as much. So this is something that I think how do we guard the I don't mean guard, but how do we basically protect local people from the sort of potential ravages, economic ravages, and also, of course, you know, the changes in global economic dynamics that are taking place. You know, so that's to me very, very serious. It means a whole different. It means basically being self-sufficient in terms of food, self-sufficient in terms of energy, if we can do that, which are the basis of all of this. You know, as long as we're dependent on the outside, then basically we're more vulnerable than we would be otherwise. So
the problem with that, and John can weigh in on it, is twofold. One is that the ruling, say, class in Hawaii is very much connected to the military, to transnational corporations in terms of globalization, etc. So would these guys who are in power and, you know, direct our life, so to speak, you know, the collective life, would they would allow us to do this? One. The other thing, in terms of if there's a problem, economic problem, etc., how would you deflect that economic problem from hitting the ruling class, for instance, people getting against them? How would they try to deflect it? And here, John can talk very well to that, because in terms of race, ethnicity, etc., division along those lines to divide the majority of the people. So John, could you say something about that, and then, reflections on what Noel has said, and then Noel can weigh in as well.
Well, if you take that global perspective on Hawaii, these corporations, transnational corporations, airlines that invest in Hawaii, they'll only do so to the extent that they can make a profit. And once they realize that it's not going to be possible, then they'll go elsewhere. And that may very well happen in the next few years. I mean, we've seen the airlines, Hawaiian Airlines, laying off thousands of workers. That's just one example. And that's a Hawaii-based airline. So some of those other big carriers to Hawaii, like United, will stop sending, or have already stopped sending, thousands of tourists each day to the islands. And I imagine these large hotel corporations that take the profits that they were making when the industry was doing so well just a year ago, have invested elsewhere, like China, rather than give it back to the workers who enable them to make those profits. So the military has a different kind of stake in Hawaii. It's strategic. That's why they're here. It has nothing to do with making a profit. So they have huge investments in what they will plan to do here. And they will stay unless there's some huge expressions of opposition to their continued presence. But for the transnational corporations, I don't see them necessarily staying as long as they believe they just can't continue to make a profit here. And so they'll just go elsewhere where they believe the money is. But going back to what Noel said about tourism and the collapse of the economy, it especially affects working people in terms of the kinds of jobs that tourism creates, service and sales jobs largely. And that's where the losses have been in our economy. The high point, the 23% unemployment rate, almost a year ago in April of 2020. So it will take, I imagine, several years for the economy to recover, but this is the opportunity that's presented. How do we diversify the economy, like you said, a term that has been used for decades without much real efforts to do so by our legislature or our governors. There has been this brain drain, this loss of people moving from Hawaii that has resulted in decline of population, or others, not to say they don't have brains, but people who can't buy a house, can't see a future for themselves raising their children in Hawaii. They've gone elsewhere on the West Coast. So there are these huge changes that have resulted, even when the tourist industry was doing well. This is when you would think people would want to stay because there's an abundance of jobs, but in fact, it affected the cost of housing, the cost of living, and therefore people have been leaving for 30 years at least, since the late 1980s.
Yeah, the affordable housing crisis is our critical crisis right now. That's the one that's driving lots of people out, and it's one that has to be fixed. And there are some small moves by the state government toward building affordable housing, and that's all to the good, because it's really horrendous. I mean, if we compare what it was like to live in Hawaii, say 40 years ago, which all of us I think remember, I mean, it was much easier. It was much easier for working people to be able to subsist. And we've we've been oblivious to what's happening. We've got a $10 minimum wage at this point. I mean, that's absurd. People talk about a $17 minimum wage being the minimum for families and to support themselves, and 10-10, I mean, lots of other localities have mandated a $15 minimum wage. I know the Republicans just sabotaged the Biden's attempt to impose a federal minimum wage for federal workers, but that's just the minimum. Really, this is the most expensive place to live in the country. We've got to be aware of it. We've got to protect our working people, and that's.
I was thinking, like, there has been a correlation between the impoverishment of the local population and the development of tourism. Like, I remember when I first came to Hawaii in 1969, there were a few million people coming, and all of a sudden it shot up to like 2019, probably 11 million or 10 point something million. That's huge. So that correlation is really interesting. And yet, the ruling circles or the ruling class in Hawaii, connected as it is to the international corporations, etc., still going the same way. And now they're talking about, like, how can we, like, open up for tourism, etc., because people like Mufi Hanneman and other people want that tourism to open up, regardless of what might happen in terms of wiping out of a lot of people, quote unquote, essential workers, wiped out by COVID-19. I mean, this is not a good way to, reproduce the economy. Shouldn't be reproduced, should be reimagined and thought out in a different way and implemented.
We have to see our local people as the real stakeholders here. I mean, they're the ones who have to be involved in decision making at the basic levels, which they've never been. And the decision makers have always been, politicians at the top and the corporate, the corporate lobby and the HVB and people like this. But citizens have never been consulted about tourism and in terms of how tourism impacts them and what they need. So ultimately, you get scenes like that on the North Shore of Kauai, where people come out and confront these tourists who are converging on the local places, and tell them, what are you doing here? Why are you coming into our areas? I mean, that's that's really ominous, because if that spreads throughout the islands, the tourism industry is in deep trouble. So that's the other thing.
So in terms of, like, as you see it, in terms of race, ethnicity, and then the political economy, how is that related? And you and John can deal with this, discussion.
Well, Noel and I were on picket lines in the hotel worker strike in fall of 2019, right? The great majority of people I saw were Filipino. There were some Hawaiians, but for other groups, well, you'd see a few, but overwhelmingly they are Filipino. And they are certainly a majority of the tourist industry workers. And as I said, the industry creates largely service and sales work, which Noel has identified as low security, low mobility kinds of jobs, low wage also, of course. And this is the problem, that tourism, as the largest creator of jobs in Hawaii, creates low wage employment. So it maintains the overall ethnic inequality in Hawaii. It does not create significant avenues for socioeconomic mobility for groups, well, beyond Filipinos. Hawaiians, large numbers also are employed in the tourist industry, and for Samoans. And some Micronesians also. So it is not an industry that the society can depend on for creating equal opportunity for groups on the bottom, as were Japanese, Chinese, Koreans historically on the plantations, can hope to advance themselves to enter the middle class.
Yeah, I'm thinking like this kind of ethnic division of the labor force, like Filipinos and the hotel industry, whatever, what have you, reminds me of the plantation workers, like the Filipino camp, the Japanese camp, etc. And then they get different wage levels, so this is an iteration, a modern iteration, quote unquote modern, to divide the workers along those lines. And during the plantation era, these were like intentional kind of policies done by the plantation owners. So how might we then reform that or change it in such a way to have equality, in terms of wages, et cetera, opportunity, and have you real equality of opportunity?
Well, it might even get worse in the future because of the modernization on the hotels, and then they begin to mechanize and they begin to automate a lot of the jobs that are done at the, like the maids and such. So there could be some sort of fairly radical reduction of jobs. That was a major issue in the last local 5 contract with the hotels that brought on the strike. In fact, the dangers of automation. So that could be a real blow too, because these are people who depend upon these jobs. If we're looking at the whole Hawaii economy, we need to be able to, and people have talked about this, we need to be able to look at the strengths that we have as a society and what's unique about us in terms of the global system or whatever, and begin to use that as a sort of mechanism for economic growth. For instance, I'm thinking, we have a whole series of institutes and institutions, whether it's the Matsunaga Peace Institute, the East-West Center, Social Science College, all that basically have a great deal of knowledge about ethnic conflict and ethnic and racial conflict, cultural conflict. And if we could weld them together in some sort of fashion, some sort of huge HUI, to form a kind of peace center that would basically offer knowledge and bring people in to do work and begin to create cultural practitioners. And some of this work is being done already at a very, very small level. But if we could do it at a fairly ambitious level, I think it would help the economic rebuilding, offer other sources of jobs and income for people, and identify Hawaii as not just a place to frolic in the sun and surf, but a place where real knowledge and skills can be located. So I'm thinking we have a number of special qualities here, and internationally we're known in some ways. So can we utilize that? And can that be used in the rebuilding process, rather than attempting to create, in 2025, have 10 million tourists coming again, sort of thing. Can we build on the strengths that we have and knowledge that we have?
Yeah, I'm thinking like here, the host culture would play a very important role, be central to it. And to me, anything that does not deal with the indigenous population at the center of any kind of solution just come to naught ultimately. So how can we then have a surrounding and protecting of the host culture and being at the core of that kind of progress and development in the interest of the overwhelming majority of the population, at least?
Oh, exactly. Indigenous knowledge now is valued in ways it has not been in the past. And here we have huge amounts of indigenous knowledge. It's time to tap that and perhaps without being too crass, to use that as part of our rebuilding process. You know, yeah.
And it's important, like, because even like someone like Jim Dator, when he was like, he's a futurist, and when before he retired, he was talking about how the indigenous culture and knowledge would be guiding us towards solving Hawaii's problems. Yeah, yeah, and not only Hawaii's problems.
Hawaii, yeah.
Because there's a lot of indigenous knowledge in the Pacific, for instance, and elsewhere, of course, that can guide us, you know, in terms of global development, etc., along different lines. John, anything? You can jump in anytime, John.
Well, going back to Noel's arguments about Hawaii, to play devil's advocate, this was advanced in Fuchs's book, Hawaii Pono, the last chapter, the last paragraph. You know, where he talks about Hawaii. Well, he didn't use the word, but what has been appropriated from the book is Hawaii as a multicultural model for the rest of the country, if not the world. But in terms of an industry, the university, to me, should be that kind of setting in terms of curriculum, in terms the kinds of programs that are and majors that are offered that would create opportunities for students to come here and learn more about Hawaii as a society where we've tried to address inequalities in different ways, but not the simplistic ideas of Hawaii as a place where everyone gets along so well with each other. That tends to be the argument.
Yeah.
In as recently as a New York Times article, want to become less racist, move to Hawaii. Yeah. But their understanding of racism is in face-to-face relations. So it's based on a study by a University of Hawaii faculty member in psychology who sampled students from the continent, white students, when they first came to Hawaii, and then after 3 years, well, how did they feel about themselves regarding issues concerning race? And the conclusion, she said, was, well, they became less racist. But this is in terms of face-to-face relations. That doesn't address the structure of racism, or is the buzzword that emerged after the George Floyd killing, systemic racism. I mean, how could you call the university a setting for in which systemic racism is absent? So that kind of discourse obscures the structural systemic dimensions of racism. And this is what we need to address, rather than kind of just advancing ourselves as a place where these issues we've already eliminated them.
Well, just look at our faculty. I mean, and we can see that there's, you know, this huge preponderance of Caucasian men, you know, and this is, you know, this in a society that's overwhelmingly, you know, not composed of Caucasian men. So, you know, that sure, absolutely, but it's the very, and what you're suggesting, I think, is very good. The flaws that Hawaii has, you know, in terms of, and more than flaws. I mean, you've pointed out very well, John, the sort of this history of racism in Hawaii. That you know, this is something we can also address. We can also, people can study the sort of problems that we have and continue to have, you know, and the inequities in this society, and you know, and personally, and get personal testimonies about that. So we not only illustrate some of the best, but we also illustrate some of the real problems that remain even in a society like this, and why they remain. And that I think that would be an excellent. You know, that would be really illuminating, you know, for those who want to deal with the whole question of racism, you know. So I think I agree with you. I think Hawaii would be, and the university would be a wonderful place, and we haven't really picked up on that. I mean, when I came to the East-West Center back in the 60s, the whole emphasis was on cultural interchange and people getting to know each other and people throughout the Pacific. And, you know, I had this wonderful Japanese roommate, Akira, who he and I are still friends, you know, 55 years later. And it's, you know, people got to know each other and appreciate each other into marriage. All of this that took place in a you know, in a really convivial atmosphere. And why can't we use this on a larger basis now? You know.
Yeah, I was at the East-West Center too. They funded my dissertation research, and I met my wife there. I met a lot of good friends from the Philippines who are still my friends. But, and it is part of the title of the East-West Center, Center for Technical and Cultural Interchange. And it does a great job of that cultural part. Like you said, people come together, they meet one another, they interact, they live with one another. But it's face-to-face relationships. You know, the larger structures of inequality, oppression, neocolonialism get obscured in the US role in Asia and the Pacific. They don't emphasize that part of the East-West Center, and the East-West Center being part of the State Department.
And Noel wrote about that in terms of how the US uses Hawaii as a launching pad to expand on the, you know, in the Pacific.
Sure.
The empire. It's this tragic empire that we built since 1945 that, you know, has absolutely devastated our resources and destroyed our reputation around the world. I mean, it's that, you know, we have to talk about that, you know, and hopefully the new government in Washington will begin to move away from this sort of militarized empire that we've had for much too long, you know, throughout our lifetimes. Yeah, that has to be done. One thing I wanted to mention was, I think it's really interesting. I think those of us who are interested in the whole question of race, racism, you know, cultural appropriation, all of this stuff, we have to look really closely at this white nationalism that was so prominent on January 6th. You know, in this attack, basically on democracy and on the Capitol, and try to not only understand it, but try to understand why so many quote unquote white people, whatever that is, another social construct, but why white people basically feel that they're being overwhelmed and you know, they feel demoralized by the immigration and the change in demography and you know, the fact that this will no longer be a white civilization, whatever that means. And I think it's very, Hawaii gives us a perspective on that we can really research and write from, because here you have a situation in which we had a Haole ruling class. And John writes, you know, very well about this, and the way they perform their, you know, they perform their racism in a very violent way on the plantations and elsewhere. And then starting in 1954, they began to lose their political authority, and to some extent, they've also lost a lot of their economic authority too. Not by no means all, but certainly some of it. And the fact that here we have Haoles who live pretty well in Hawaii, and if you look at the per capita income and all of this, they're doing fairly well. And yet they've lost the kind of political and economic power that we hear these white nationalists talking about. So this might be an interesting example of how you can basically lose your predominance in a civilization and still retain, you know, some degree of, you know, basically respect and economic security. So that's just something I've been working on and just thinking about it, because I think we really have to answer some of the misinformation, the disinformation that's being put out about, you know, about the fate of white people in our society. So,
but here there's another thing, like how, you know, and remember the civil rights movement, et cetera, et cetera. and the integration of blacks into the various classes. So you had blacks that went into the ruling class, and you have like CEOs and this and that, and Wall Streeters and all of that, one. And then you have blacks in the working class, like say Chicago, Philadelphia, etc., etc. Here in Hawaii, similarly, like Asians, perhaps Chinese and Japanese go into the different classes. Like some join, become like someone like head of Bank of Hawaii, for instance, or someone sort of Pacific Bank or whatever. I'm just making up these kinds of names just as quick examples. And then you have like Japanese and Chinese and Hawaiians. Hawaiians also in the ruling class, but Hawaiians also on the beach, living on the beach, you know what I'm saying? So here it is the integration of the different ethnicities and races into the classes that are available, like, ruling class, working class, what have you. So that's another thing that we need to pay attention to. One other thing quick on the university, maybe the university wants to try and figure out a way to, have Hawaii recover from its economic crisis and cultural crisis, whatever. But the thing is that the worldview that they have is still tied, look at who is on the Board of Regents, for instance, and it's tied to downtown, so to speak, which is business, whatever. So that is the thing that brought us to where we are, even before COVID-19, in terms of economic crisis and all the ills, etc. And now they want to have the same kind of medicine, so to speak, to solve the question, that kind of medicine brought us to ultimately.
Yeah, and I think, the question of what happens to the university now, given the budget shortfall, is really critical. Some of the, if we're talking about defunding large parts of the university, and we're talking about laying off young faculty, I mean, we're really undermining the economic future of Hawaii too, because it's this university and the community colleges are going to be instrumental in any kind of real economic revival. So this is very short-term thinking, and if we're talking about and a lot of the liberal arts that they're talking about cutting, liberal arts departments, etc., are the ones that are creating. This is where the creative thinking takes place, and this is where the graduates are able to, to negotiate all kinds of different cultural challenges and other challenges, and make a difference. And I think employers are recognizing that. So I think all of us are worried about that. What happens to, programs and departments that really can, they appear on the surface to be, expendable, but they're not. They're really crucial to the future of our society.
Yeah, maybe John can speak to that now that it's the 50th anniversary of ethnic studies, and how they will, administration wanted to like cut ethnic studies, rather than like increase that kind of curriculum that ethnic studies has, and generalize it to other places, so that they can like begin to think about the multiracial, multi-ethnic problem in relationship to the political economy, etc. So, John.
Well, I'll just bring up this issue in the context of budget cutbacks for the state as a whole, the loss of state tax revenues, and the university budget. But there's this proposal, $6 million to renovate the lower campus for more fans to attend UH football games, because the stadium will be closed for the next 3 years. We have this proposal coming out of the Board of Regents now, and of course the funding, they're going to appeal to the legislature. $6 million. Where are they going to find that money? And Whereas, like you just said, oh, everything has to be cut. Every program is subject to these cutbacks. The administrators all took pay cuts, and this is threatened with the faculty also. But nonetheless, oh, they're still looking for this $6 million now for football, so that the dwindling number of fans who were already stopped going to the games at Aloha Stadium can still attend, those diehard fans who support the UH football team. But I wanted to ask Noel, in the context of the question you asked, what difference do you think ethnic studies had made in its 50 years in enhancing the quality of life for the people of Hawaii?
Well, I can only judge from, I mean, the best thing that I did in my 48 years of working with ethnic studies was basically, you know, it wasn't so much the writing or the other stuff. It was basically the community work we did with students, and they really were able to access a different world and different social classes than the ones they knew about, different ethnic groups. It really expanded their view, their dimensions of who they were in their adult lives. And also the work we did in class. They were able to take on a sort of critical view of the world. I think we created people who are better citizens, who are perhaps kinder, more compassionate people, I hope. And you know, that was all to the good. And you know, we did a lot of work. And you know, when I'm in contact with students now, and you know, I'm still writing recommendations for them, and you know, and they tell me what they're into, which is, you know, things like public health and education, and the values are really good, and they're there because they really have a commitment to the common good and you know, the public good. And I think that's what we've done, all of us, all three of us, and you know, the rest of us in our department, that we've basically spread the kind of values that we have, and that can sustain our society and you know, and our species, if I can say that, in the coming years, which are going to be, you know, full of all sorts of huge challenges, like, you know, the climate crisis and all of that.
We have a few minutes left, I think 5. So I want to ask you, you know, to speak to two things. One, you have a book called America in 1900s. That title, remember? Could you speak about that, and how you, why did you write it, one? And two, how you envision your role as emeritus professor, you know, in terms of Hawaii and trying to solve those kinds of problems. Yeah.
The book that I wrote, you know, quite a while ago was an attempt to show that a lot of the problems that we had in 1900s, such as racism, economic inequality, a ruling class which was very, very rigid and was, was not acting in the interests of a large number of people in this country, that we still had that in 2000, because I wrote the book in 2000, and you know, and I think that would be even more. That book even makes even more sense now. I mean, given all its flaws and, you know, the problems of, you know, 20 years later, but yeah, we've really seen this in the pandemic in terms of who's gotten the rates of mortality and the people who've been impacted the worst, including in Hawaii, where Pacific Islanders have been impacted the worst, the poorest people. And the other things. What was the second question here?
What your role might be, as, you know, in your new designation as Professor Emeritus.
People told me when I retired, you know, I'm busier now than when I was working, and I didn't understand how that was true. Maybe John has the same feeling that I do, but yeah, I've been doing I've been very active, the legislative session's about to start, and I've been very active in politics, and I've been involved in protests against the Trump people, and all this disinformation about stolen election. And I've been trying to I've been taking some courses with Ali Osha, and I've got a class at 3 o'clock at senior housing. I'm doing a class with a group of students. So I've been trying to be as active as possible, and the enormity of what we're facing at this point, it really moves me to try to, as long as I'm able, as long as I have the mental or physical capacity, to be really involved and committed to social change, to some degree, some radical social change in this in Hawaii and throughout the society. And this upsurge of white nationalism, this upsurge of racism, really, it frightens me, and I'm trying to do everything I can in my own modest way to rally people against it as much as possible. So
we each have a role to play in our little own way. Yeah. John, you want to say something? We have like 3 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I did have a question about Noel's book, America in 1900. It would be to comment on the current situation, and you kind of alluded to that already, because in the last chapter of your book, you commented on the political economic situation in 2000. So in 2020, then what are the kinds of thoughts that come first to your mind about what's going on in America?
Well, the country is really coming apart. I mean, and the idea that there'd be an assault on the Capitol by armed white, nationalists, the Proud Boys and others, it would have been inconceivable in 2000. That the polarization that has occurred that the Republican Party would become a party of white supremacy and at some levels a party of fascism would have been inconceivable. I mean, the deterioration and the crisis has really deepened much more quickly than any of us, including me, could have imagined. And we didn't conceive that we could make that somebody like Trump could take power and then for 4 years, basically run a regime that undermined democracy and was totally destructive to the institutions of the country, including the federal bureaucracy, which we really depend upon.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're in a much more serious crisis than any of us, I think, could have imagined, 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have to respond at this point.
Absolutely. And I was thinking like that shatters this false notion of American exceptionalism. So, we are not outside of history, or we don't have a history for ourselves only, and the rest of the world has its own other history. So this American exceptionalism has been shattered completely, and we should be a bit more modest in terms of trying to find solutions and think of us like equal to other people all over the world, So anyway, we're flat out of time. We will continue this when we do another program, where the 3 of us will be there as well. And
retire.
Mahalo nui loa, and thank you for our viewers, and see you next time.
Mahalo nui loa. Mahalo nui loa.